Chris Bowen, welcome to News 24.
Thanks, Lyndall.
If we could start with the briefing that the opposition will be given this afternoon, without going into the details of what the officials will put to the opposition, can you say the amendments you will put forward will be exactly as you've described, changes that only go to allowing offshore processing, not to any place it might happen in?
Well, the changes that we are proposing to the Parliament, we'll brief the opposition on this afternoon, are as we've described, which is to restore the common understanding of the law before the High Court's ruling, was that it was the discretion of the government of the day, and the Minister of the day in particular, as to where to conduct offshore processing. That's what we'll be putting to the opposition, and that's what our amendments are designed to achieve.
And you won't, if the opposition agrees to them, in any way seek to tie the opposition to your Malaysian solution?
No, we've been very clear. The opposition is opposed to the Malaysia Agreement. We understand that. We respect that and accept that. We very strongly disagree with that. This is a matter of principle that the government of the day should have the authority to implement its policies, as Mr Abbott said just a little while ago, within the last 2 weeks, that he thought was the case, that the government of the day should have the authority to implement its policies. Now, we think that Mr Abbott should be able to implement Nauru if he becomes Prime Minister. We don't agree with Nauru. We don't think it's good policy or sound policy based on all the advice we have, but we think he should have the right to do it, just as all the advice to us tells us that the best way to deter people from getting on boats is the Malaysia Agreement, and we should have the ability to implement it, and we'll be accountable for it. We'll be accountable for its successes, for its criticisms, etc. We won't be saying that Mr Abbott supported the Malaysia arrangement. We'll be saying he supported legislation in the national interest if that's what he does.
He's written today in a blog that the Prime Minister is seeking to break a pre-election commitment that the government wouldn't send asylum seekers to a country that hadn't signed the Refugee Convention, and he asks at the end, why should the coalition help her break her word? If he says no to the changes, do you have another option?
Well, we want to implement our option. I've seen the opposition saying, oh, well, what's plan B? Well, plan A is what counts here, and plan A is the Malaysia arrangement. And we want the flexibility to introduce the Malaysia arrangement, to increase the refugee intake, and to take the next 800 asylum seekers who arrive in Australia by boat to Malaysia as a very significant deterrent. Now, here's the test, Lyndall. People are watching. The people smugglers are watching. Others are watching. Is Australia going to blink? Is Tony Abbott going to blink? The Labor Party and the Liberal Party are both meant to believe in offshore processing. The question is, will Mr Abbott put his votes behind offshore processing? Will he support legislation for offshore processing? I saw Mr Morrison today saying, oh, we won't need legislation to do Nauru. That's just wrong. I mean, it flies in the face of the legal consensus. It's in fantasy land if they think that they can implement offshore processing without very significant risk of successful legal challenge without supporting the government's legislation.
But if Nauru implements domestic law to back its signing of the UN Refugee Convention, isn't there a prospect that it could bring its laws into line with what the High Court wants without need for legislative change here?
Well, the High Court made it clear on its interpretation of the existing Act that they regarded the conditions across the board that apply to asylum seekers in any offshore third country is having to be very comparable to Australia's. Hence you've had, for example, Professor Donald Rothwell say that the only country in our region which could comply with the High Court's interpretation is New Zealand, and that matches the legal advice not only to the government from 3 senior counsel but also from Ron Merkel QC and Mr Estcourt QC, all of which have said that they would think that Nauru, and a detention centre at Nauru, would be open to a very significant risk of legal challenge.
Even if Nauru did enact domestic law?
Yes, that's the advice to us. And the opposition also has this issue. I think it's very clear that the High Court ruling would make it unworkable to remove unaccompanied minors to any third country. So the opposition, if they don't support the legislation, would have to weigh up, well, are we going to have boatloads of unaccompanied children arriving in our shores because they can't take them to Nauru or to anywhere else because the High Court has said that that would be judicially reviewable as to the best interest of the child, and that would make any practical implementation of the removal of unaccompanied minors completely not possible. So the opposition has got a lot of problems if they think that they can carry on with an offshore processing regime under existing law without supporting government legislation to amend it.
Malaysia has again said it wants the transfer deal with Australia to happen, but all the guarantees still won't have any legal force in Malaysia. Will it be better if they did?
Well, look, this is a firm agreement from the Malaysian government. I was very encouraged again, but not surprised to see Minister Hishammuddin's comments in the media this morning saying that Malaysia is committed to the arrangement, that they want to work with Australia and that they are very committed to providing the protections, and making the point that I've made before, that it'll all be open and accountable publicly, and they'll be working to ensure that those protections are implemented. And Malaysia should be taken at its word. I think some of the criticisms of Malaysia from the opposition in the recent week have been very unfortunate. And Malaysia is a good friend of Australia, and they are working with Australia to have consistent treatment of refugees and asylum seekers across the region. They recognise that it's a regional problem. I note that Malaysia has pointed out today, for example, Minister Hishammuddin, that they don't see Nauru having any deterrent effect or not being part of the regional framework. So really, I think people should take the commitments of Malaysia at face value and in good faith, and I'm very disappointed in some of the criticisms and commentary coming from Mr Abbott and Mr Morrison about Malaysia. I think that does not do them any credit.
Finally, Minister, will either you or the Prime Minister be negotiating with the opposition directly on the changes to the Migration Act?
Well, we've made clear our position that we want to work with the opposition. If the opposition has constructive comments to make, then of course we would respond accordingly, and the Prime Minister will be obviously responding accordingly to the opposition's position. We want to work constructively with them. We are putting forward what we see as a very sensible way forward. If the opposition wants to work in good faith with us, then we'd work in good faith with them. But our position is clear. We're putting the legislation there. We want the legislation to be able to provide for the Malaysia arrangement because we think it works. We want it to provide for the Nauru arrangement, not because we think it'll work. We don't think it would, but we think that the government of the day, should it ever be Mr Abbott and the Liberal Party, should have the right to implement their policies. Mr Abbott said as much recently. If he's changed that position, that will be very disappointing, and it will see the Liberal Party walking away not only from the government of the day having the ability to implement its policies, but also from support for offshore processing.
So will you pick up the phone to Mr Abbott after the briefing this afternoon?
Well, let's let the briefing occur, and let's let Mr Abbott and Mr Morrison have the facts before them, and then we'll see the situation unfold after that. But clearly, our position is very clear. We want to see the legislation. We want to see it in the form that we propose, and then the ball's in Mr Abbott's court.
Chris Bowen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Lyndall.